In 1346, the Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories and was one of the most important English triumphs in the Hundred Years' War. Along with the Battle of Crécy, 1346, and the Battle of Poitiers, 1356. Normandy, and Touraine, as well as Aquitaine. In 1356, in the ensuing negotiations, Henry said that he would give up his claim to the French throne if the French would pay the 1.6 million crowns outstanding. In 1396, this use of stakes could have been inspired by the Battle of Nicopolis of 1396. From the ransom of John II, who had been captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, and concede English ownership of the lands of Anjou, Brittany, Flanders, where forces of the Ottoman Empire used the tactic against French cavalry. In 1414, in December 1414, the English Parliament was persuaded to grant Henry a double subsidy, a tax at twice the traditional rate. In 1414, he initially called a great council in the spring of 1414 to discuss going to war with France, to recover his inheritance from the French. John Keegan argues that the longbow's main influence on the battle at this point was injuries to horses, armored only on the head. But the lords insisted that he should negotiate further and moderate his claims. Mortimer notes the presence of non-combatant pages only. Many horses would have become dangerously out of control when struck in the back or flank by the high elevation, long-range shots used as the charge started. In 1415, it took place on October 25, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, near Agincourt, in northern France. Other benefits to the English were longer term. The French archers seem to have played almost no part, except possibly for an initial volley of arrows at the start of the battle. In 1415, on April 19, 1415, Henry again asked the Great Council to sanction war with France, and this time they agreed. Rearguard, in incomparable number and still fresh. Rogers says each of the 10,000 men-at-arms would be accompanied by a gros valet, an armored and mounted military servant, and a non-combatant page. Counts the former as fighting men, and concludes thus that the French in fact numbered 24,000. Historians disagree less about the French numbers. A further 600 dismounted men-at-arms stood in each wing, the left under the Count of Vendôme and the right under the Count of Richemont. The cavalry force, which could have devastated the English line if it had attacked while they moved their stakes, to be received in triumph in London on the 23rd. It is likely that the English adopted their usual battle line of longbowmen on either flank, with men-at-arms and knights in the center. Charged only after the initial volley of arrows from the English. Contemporary chroniclers did not criticize Henry for ordering the killing. The original play does not, however, feature any scenes of the actual battle itself, leading critic Rose Zimbardo to characterize it as full of warfare, indicating that they would ride the spare horses during the battle and be mistakenly thought of as combatants by the English. Increasingly, they had to walk around or over fallen comrades, which Henry delivers movingly to his soldiers just before the battle, urging his band of brothers to stand together in the forthcoming fight. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the battle ended in an overwhelming victory for the English. Resume fighting. Ian Mortimer endorsed Currie's methodology, though applied it more liberally, noting how she minimizes French numbers, by limiting her figures to those in the fighting. Opening moves on the morning of October 25, the French were still waiting for additional troops to arrive, solving the disagreement over claims to the French throne. Basic army and a few specific additional companies, and maximizes English numbers, by assuming the numbers sent home from Harfleur were no greater than 6. The Battle of Agincourt, Agincourt, French, Agincourt, Agincourt, was an English victory in the Hundred Years' War. Aftermath: the French had suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Gesta Henrici places this after the English had overcome the onslaught of the French men-at-arms and the weary English troops were eyeing the French, yet empty of conflict. The play introduced the famous St. Crispin's Day speech, considered one of Shakespeare's most heroic speeches. Dennis, Mortimer gives 14 or 15,000 fighting men. The English had very little food, had marched 260 miles for 120 kilometers in 2.5 weeks, were suffering from sickness such as dysentery. Lists, and concluded that the most extreme imbalance which is credible is 15,000 French against 8,000 to 9,000 English. This entailed abandoning his chosen position. As the melee developed, the French second line also joined the attack, but they too were swallowed up, the narrow terrain hampering their effectiveness. Henry would marry Catherine, Charles VI's young daughter, and receive a dowry of 2 million crowns. And contemporaries. It is unclear whether the delay occurred because the French were hoping the English would launch a frontal assault and were surprised when the English instead. Although it had been planned for the archers and crossbowmen to be placed with the infantry wings, started shooting from their new defensive position, or whether the French mounted knights instead did not react quickly enough to the English advance. They were now regarded as unnecessary and placed behind them instead. These stakes had to be pulled out of the ground, carried to the army's new position, and reinstalled to defend the English lines. Partially as a result, the battle was used as a metaphor at the beginning of the First World War. Brannau's version gives a longer, more realist portrayal of the battle itself, drawing on both historical sources and images from the Vietnam and Falkland Wars. When the British Expeditionary Force's attempts to stop the German advances were widely likened to it, without realizing that they were hindering the ability of those at the front to maneuver and fight by pushing them into the English formation of lance points. Setting battlefield. The precise location of the battle is not known. It did not lead to further English conquests immediately, as Henry's priority was to return to England, which he did on November 16. Entire noble families were wiped out in the male line, and in some regions an entire generation of landed nobility was annihilated. There was a special, elite cavalry force whose purpose was to break the formation of the English archers and thus clear the way for the infantry to advance. The mounted charge and subsequent retreat churned up the already muddy terrain between the French and the English. This moment of the battle is portrayed both as a break with the traditions of chivalry and as a key example of the paradox of kingship. And were greatly outnumbered by well-equipped French men-at-arms. Juliet Barker quotes a contemporary account by a monk from St. Denis Basilica who reports how the wounded and panicking horses galloped through the advancing Agincourt. Today there is a modern museum in Agincourt village dedicated to the battle. Mortimer also considers that the gesta vastly inflates the English casualties, 5,000, at Harfleur, and that despite the trials of the march, the unexpected victory of the vastly outnumbered English troops against the French army boosted English morale and prestige, crippled France. Henry had lost very few men to illness or death, and we have independent testimony that no more than 160 had been captured on the way, and started a new period of English dominance in the war. Accounts of the battle describe the French engaging the English men-at-arms before being rushed from the sides by the longbowmen as the melee developed. The museum lists the names of combatants of both sides who died in the battle. Such an event would have posed a risk to the still outnumbered English and could have easily turned their victory into a mutually destructive defeat, as the Dukes of Alençon and Bar led the main battle. English forces were now largely intermingled with the French and would have suffered grievously from the arrows of their own longbowmen had they needed to. Rogers suggested that the French at the back of their deep formation would have been attempting to push the advance forward. A recent reappraisal of Henry's strategy of the Agincourt campaign incorporates these three accounts and argues that war was seen as a legal due process for Keegan, estimating that only around 200 archers were involved in the task and recognizing the difficulty of killing thousands of prisoners quickly. Rogers, Mortimer, and Sumption all give more or less 10,000 men-at-arms for the French, using as a source the Herald of the Duke of Berry, an eyewitness speculates that relatively few prisoners were actually killed before the French reserves fled the field and Henry rescinded the order. These numbers are based on the Gesta Henrici Quinti and the Chronicle of Jean Lefebvre, the only two eyewitness accounts on the English camp. Shakespeare illustrates these tensions by depicting Henry's decision to kill some of the French prisoners. According to the heralds, 3,069 knights and squires were killed, while at least 2,600 more corpses were found without coats of arms to identify them. Whilst attempting to justify it and distance himself from the event, in which the longbowmen were defended from cavalry charges by long sharpened wooden stakes set in the ground and pointed towards the French lines. He also intended the maneuver as a deliberate provocation to battle aimed at the Dauphin. He claimed the title of King of France through his great-grandfather Edward III of England, although in practice the English kings were generally prepared to, who had failed to respond to Henry's personal challenge to combat at Harfleur. Renounce this claim if the French would acknowledge the English claim on Aquitaine and other French lands, the terms of the Treaty of Bretigny. A second, smaller mounted force was to attack the rear of the English army, along with its baggage and servants. Rather than retire directly to England for the winter, after his costly expedition had captured only one town, Henry decided to march most of his army, roughly. The bailiffs of 9 major northern towns were killed, often along with their sons, relatives, and supporters. 9,000, through Normandy to the port of Calais, the English stronghold in northern France, to demonstrate by his presence in the territory at the head of an army. It established the legitimacy of the Lancastrian monarchy and the future campaigns of Henry to pursue his rights and privileges in France. Barker opined that if the differential really was as low as 3-4, then this makes a nonsense of the course of the battle as described by eyewitnesses. So they were already overcome with fatigue even before they advanced against the enemy. Theodore Beck also suggests that among Henry's army was the king's physician and a little band of surgeons. Infantry, scattering them and trampling them down in their headlong flight from the battlefield. These included the Duke of York, the young Earl of Suffolk and the Welsh esquire Dafydd, Davy, Gam. He contrasts the modern English king and his army with the medieval, chivalric, older model of the French. The campaign season was coming to an end, and the English army had suffered many casualties through disease. The army of about 12,000 men and up to 20,000 horses besieged the port of Harfleur. The English Gesta Henrici described 3 great heaps of the slain around the 3 main English standards. Popular representations. The battle remains an important symbol in popular culture. Henry ordered the slaughter of most of the French prisoners, possibly numbering in the thousands. Rogers, on the other hand, finds the number 5,000 plausible, giving several analogous historical events to support his case. And Barker considers that the fragmentary pay records which Currie relies on actually support the lower estimates. Some 200 mounted men-at-arms would attack the English rear. Apparently, Henry believed his fleeing army would perform better on the defensive, but had to halt the retreat and somehow engage the French before a defensive battle was possible. The 2 armies spent the night of October 24 on open ground. Jean de Wavrin, a knight on the French side, wrote that English fatalities were 1,600 men of all ranks. The play focuses on the pressures of kingship, the tensions between how a king should appear, chivalric, honest, and just, and how a king must sometimes act, Machiavellian and ruthless. King Henry V of England led his troops into battle and participated in hand-to-hand fighting. Several films have been made featuring or depicting this battle, typically based upon Shakespeare's work. During the siege, the French had raised an army which assembled around Rouen. That his right to rule in the duchy was more than a mere abstract legal and historical claim. In 1415, after several decades of relative peace, the English had resumed the war in 1415 amid the failure of negotiations with the French. In 1415, Henry's army landed in northern France on August 13, 1415, carried by a vast fleet. Governor of Cambrai and supporter of the French crown. In 1415, by 1415, negotiations had ground to a halt, and the English felt that the French had mocked their claims and ridiculed Henry himself. In 1429, that advantage lasted for 14 years, until England was defeated by France in 1429 during the Siege of Orleans. For 3 hours after sunrise there was no fighting. In his study of the battle, John Keegan argued that the main aim was not to actually kill the French prisoners but rather to terrorize them into submission and, in 1453, detailed list of French casualties. Contemporary account of battle by Enguerrand de Monstrelet, d. 1453. Combined with the English men-at-arms. Quell any possibility they might resume the fight, which would probably have caused the uncommitted French reserve forces to join the fray, as well. Very quickly after the battle, the fragile truce between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions broke down. Senior soldier. The French could not cope with the thousands of lightly armored longbowmen assailants, who were much less hindered by the mud and weight of their armor. In all, around 6,000 of their fighting men were killed. Of grief in the aftermath of the battle. Of the great royal office holders, France lost its constable, Albret, and admiral, the Lord of Dampierre, the master of crossbowmen, David de Rambures. Numbers at Agincourt. Most primary sources which describe the battle have the English outnumbered by several times. Were still in danger. In some accounts the attack happened towards the end of the battle, and led the English to think they were being attacked from the rear. After Henry V marched to the north, the French moved to block them along the river Somme. Thomas Morsteed, Henry V royal surgeon. Certainly, d'Agincourt was a local knight, but he might have been chosen to lead the attack because of his local knowledge and the lack of availability of a more. Recent heavy rain had made the battlefield very muddy, proving very tiring to walk through in full plate armor. This head-lowered position restricted their breathing and their vision. French court writer Christine de Pizan wrote a poem entitled Epistère de la prison de vie humaine, letter concerning the prison of human life, about feelings. Dead along with 3 sons, the master of the royal household, Guichard Dauphin, and Prevet of the Marshals. And the other from Enguerrand de Monstrelet. Since the French had many more men-at-arms than the English, they would accordingly be accompanied by a far greater number of servants. Currie, Rogers, and Mortimer all agree that the French had 4,000 to 5,000 missile troops. This film takes inspiration from Shakespeare's Henriade plays. The Burgundian sources have him concluding the speech by telling his men that the French had boasted that they would cut off 2 fingers from the right hand of. Sumption, thus, concludes that the French had 14,000 men, basing himself on the Monk of St. according to Monstrelet, were all marching to join the army. There had been a suggestion that the English would run away rather than give battle when they saw that they would be fighting so many French princes. They were successful for a time, forcing Henry to move south, away from Calais, to find a ford. Though some historians omit them from the number of combatants. Lefebvre and Wavrin similarly say that it was signs of the French rearguard regrouping and marching forward in battle order which made the English think they. The English knights refused to assist in the killing of these prisoners due to their belief that it was unchivalrous. Including a crown. Had previously been contracted by the king to supply a team of surgeons and makers of surgical instruments to take part in the Agincourt campaign. Every archer, so that he could never draw a longbow again. Gathering sticky clay all the way. 2 of the most frequently cited accounts come from Burgundian sources, one from Jean Lefebvre de Saint-Remy, who was present at the battle. This was not strictly a feudal army, but an army paid through a system similar to that of the English. The Duke of Brabant, about 2,000 men, the Duke of Anjou, about 600 men, and the Duke of Brittany, 6,000 men. This lack of unity in France allowed Henry 18 months to prepare militarily and politically for a renewed campaign. Prompting Henry's remark, "O God, thy arm was here." Probably each man-at-arms would be accompanied by a gros valet, or varlet, an armed servant, adding up to another 10,000 potential fighting men. The rear guard, leaderless, would serve as a dumping ground for the surplus troops. Yards, 270 m. In which Isambard d'Agincourt, leading a small number of men-at-arms and varlets plus about 600 peasants, seized some of Henry's personal treasures. Without a river obstacle to defend, the French were hesitant to force a battle. The number is supported by many other contemporary accounts. The king received an axe blow to the head, which knocked off a piece of the crown that formed part of his helmet. The French were organized into 2 main groups, or battles, a vanguard up front and a main battle behind. While Monstrelet reported 600 English dead. Its proportions of English archers to men-at-arms at the battle are also different from those of the English army before the siege of Harfleur. Both composed principally of men-at-arms fighting on foot and flanked by more of the same in each wing. He ordered only the highest-ranked prisoners to be spared. The English and Welsh archers on the flanks drove pointed wooden stakes, or palings, into the ground at an angle to force cavalry to veer off. Henry, worried about the enemy launching surprise raids, and wanting his troops to remain focused. Now at close range. Upon hearing that his youngest brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester had been wounded in the groin, Henry took his household guard and stood over his brother. Ordered all his men to spend the night before the battle in silence, on pain of having an ear cut off. Then they had to walk a few hundred yards, meters, through thick mud and a press of comrades while wearing armor weighing 50 to 60 pounds, 23 to 27 kilograms. The use of stakes was an innovation for the English. During the Battle of Crecy, for example, the army was divided into 3 groups, the right wing led by Edward, Duke of York, the center led by the king himself. The archers had been instead protected by pits and other obstacles. Rogers suggested that the longbow could penetrate a wrought iron breastplate at short range and penetrate the thinner armor on the limbs even at 220 yards, 200. They were blocking Henry's retreat, and were willing to wait for as long as it took. Shakespeare's portrayal of the casualty loss is ahistorical in that the French are stated to have lost 10,000 and the English less than 30 men. Attack on the English baggage train. The only French success was an attack on the lightly protected English baggage train. Barker, Sumption, and Rogers all wrote that the English probably had 6,000 men, these being 5,000 archers and 900 to 1,000 men at arms. Albret, Boucicaut, and almost all the leading noblemen were assigned stations in the vanguard. Main French assault despite advancing through what the French monk of St. Denis described as a terrifying hail of arrow shot, the plate armor of the French. In any case, to protect themselves as much as possible from the arrows. Men-at-arms allowed them to close the distance to the English lines after the English longbowmen started shooting from extreme longbow range, approximately 300. The French had to lower their visors and bend their helmeted heads to avoid being shot in the face. Many lords and gentlemen demanded and received position in the front lines, where they would have a higher chance of acquiring glory and valuable ransoms. As the eye and air holes in their helmets were among the weakest points in the armor. This resulted in the bulk of the men-at-arms being massed in the front lines and the other troops, for which there was no remaining space, being placed behind. The recently ploughed land hemmed in by dense woodland favored the English, both because of its narrowness. Immediately after the battle, Henry summoned the heralds of the 2 armies who had watched the battle together with principal French herald Montjoy. And because of the thick mud through which the French knights had to walk, the brunt of the battle had fallen on the Armagnacs, and it was they who suffered the majority of senior casualties and carried the blame for the defeat. Barker, following the Gesta Henrici, believed to have been written by an English chaplain who was actually in the baggage train. The next day the French initiated negotiations as a delaying tactic, but Henry ordered his army to advance and to start a battle that concluded that the attack happened at the start of the battle. Given the state of his army, he would have preferred to avoid, or to fight defensively. That was how Crecy and the other famous longbow victories had been won. Both note that the Gesta vastly overestimates the number of French in the battle. The surviving French men-at-arms reached the front of the English line and pushed it back, while the longbowmen on the flanks continued to shoot. The prisoners outnumbered their captors. According to most chroniclers, Henry feared that the prisoners would realize their advantage in numbers, rearmed themselves with the weapons strewn about the field, and overwhelmed the exhausted English forces. They shadowed Henry's army while calling a semence de nobles, calling on local nobles to join the army. Henry returned a conquering hero, seen as blessed by God in the eyes of his subjects and European powers outside France. In the front rank of the fighting until Humphrey could be dragged to safety. French chroniclers agree that when the mounted charge did come, it did not contain as many men as it should have. Gilles Lubouvier states that some had wandered off to warm themselves and others were walking or feeding their horses. He considered a knight in the best quality steel armor invulnerable to an arrow on the breastplate or top of the helmet, but vulnerable to shots hitting the limbs, particularly at close range. And the left wing under the old and experienced Baron Thomas Camoes. A paucity of archaeological evidence, though, has led to a debate as to the exact location of the battlefield. Barker states that some knights, encumbered by their armor, actually drowned in their helmets. In the ensuing campaign, many soldiers died from disease, and the English numbers dwindled. They tried to withdraw to English-held Calais but found their path blocked by a considerably larger French army. King Charles VI of France did not command the French army as he suffered from psychotic illnesses and associated mental incapacity. And they settled on the name of the battle as Agincourt, after the nearest fortified place. The town surrendered on September 22, and the English army did not leave until October 8. The English men-at-arms in plate and mail were placed shoulder to shoulder 4 deep. While numerous English sources give the English casualties in double figures, record evidence identifies at least 112 Englishmen killed in the fighting. Background: Henry V invaded France following the failure of negotiations with the French. French cavalry attack. The French cavalry, despite being disorganized and not at full numbers, charged towards the longbowmen. Presumably because they were the most likely to fetch a large ransom under the chivalric system of warfare. A complete coat of plate was considered such good protection that shields were generally not used. Although the Burgundian contemporary sources distinguished between Frenchmen who used shields and those who did not. And Rogers has suggested that the front elements of the French force used axes and shields. The French knights were unable to outflank the longbowmen because of the encroaching woodland. They were also unable to charge through the array of sharpened stakes that protected the archers. They might also have deployed some archers in the center of the line. Contemporary accounts. The Battle of Agincourt is well documented by at least 7 contemporary accounts, 3 from eyewitnesses. In 1599, literature. The most famous cultural depiction of the battle today is in Act 4 of William Shakespeare's Henry V, written in 1599. In 1453, detailed list of French casualties. Contemporary account of battle by Enguerrand de Montstrelet, d. 1453. Governor of Cambrai and supporter of the French crown. In 1599, the battle continues to fascinate scholars and the general public, and forms the backdrop to notable works such as William Shakespeare's play Henry V. In 1944, notable popular examples include Henry V from 1944, starring Laurence Olivier. Written in 1599. In 1989, Henry V from 1989, starring Kenneth Branagh. In 2004, notes, references, citations, general sources, further reading, external links. Battle of Agincourt Memorial 50.454269 degrees north 2.151384 degrees east /50.454269, 2.151384. Presenter, with Curry, Michael Jones, and John Watts, September 16, 2004. In which the battle forms a central component. The Agincourt Battlefield Archaeology Project, Tim Sutherland, Project Director, Agincourt Museum. Battle of Agincourt on In Our Time at the BBC, Bragg, Melvin. That the French army was 12,000 strong, and the English army 9,000, proportions of 4:3. English deployment early on the 25th. In 2005, by contrast, and Curry in her 2005 book Agincourt, A New History argued, based on research into the surviving administrative records. Lieutenant Col John Woodford and Excavations at Agincourt, September 17, 2015, Agincourt 600 Conference, by Tim Sutherland. Swords, and the Burgundian sources have a similar passage. In 2015, Battle of Agincourt on Medieval Archives podcast. Battle of Agincourt animated map by David Crowther. Agincourt campaign animated map by David Crowther. In 2019, The King from 2019, starring Timothée Chalamet as Henry V and Robert Pattinson as the Dauphin of Villenois. Rogers criticized Curry's reliance on administrative records. In 2019, the historian Michael Livingston also made the case for a site west of Agincourt, based on a review of sources and early maps. Attack the now disordered, fatigued and wounded French men-at-arms massed in front of them. Produced in the first half of the 15th century. When the archers ran out of arrows, they dropped their bows and, using hatchets, swords, spears and the mallets they had used to drive their stakes in. The French hoped to raise 9,000 troops, but the army was not ready in time to relieve Harfleur. Juliet Barker, Jonathan Sumption, and Clifford J. In the words of Juliet Barker, the battle cut a great swath through the natural leaders of French society in Artois, Ponthieu, Normandy. Richemont, brother of the Duke of Brittany and stepbrother of Henry V, and Harcourt, and Marshal Jean Le Maingre. Sides of the men-at-arms. Picardy. Estimates of the number of prisoners vary between 700 and 2,200, amongst them the Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon, the Counts of Eu, Vendôme, Morley, Nevers, Roussy, Vaucourt, Vaudemont, and one Viscount, Puiset, also an archbishop. Made just before the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Among them were 90 to 120 great lords and banneret killed, including 3 dukes, Alençon, Bar, and Brabant, 9 counts, Blamont, Dreux, Fauconberg, Grandpré. The archers were commanded by Sir Thomas Erpingham, another elderly veteran, but could penetrate the poorer quality wrought iron armor. When that campaign took place, it was made easier by the damage done to the political and military structures of Normandy by the battle. The deep, soft mud particularly favored the English force because, once knocked to the ground, states the French probably had 12,000 to 15,000 troops. Henry deployed his army, approximately 1,500 men-at-arms and 7,000 longbowmen, across a 750-yard (690 meters) part of the defile. The heavily armored French knights had a hard time getting back up to fight in the melee. According to contemporary English accounts, Henry fought hand-to-hand. Dennis says, their vanguard, composed of about 5,000 men, found itself at first so tightly packed that those who were in the third rank could scarcely use their. Both lines were arrayed in tight, dense formations of about 16 ranks each, and were positioned a bowshot length from each other. Other ballads followed, including King Henry V's conquest of France. Henry made a speech emphasizing the justness of his cause, and reminding his army of previous great defeats the kings of England had inflicted on the French. Shakespeare's play presented Henry as leading a truly English force into battle. Currie and Mortimer questioned the reliability of the Gesta, as there have been doubts as to how much it was written as propaganda for Henry V, playing on the importance of the link between the monarch and the common soldiers in the fight. Music and poetry. Soon after the victory at Agincourt, a number of popular folk songs were created about the battle, the most famous being the Agincourt Carol. The English finally crossed the Somme south of Peronne, at Bethencourt and Voyens, and resumed marching north. The French responded with what they considered the generous terms of marriage with Catherine, a dowry of 600,000 crowns, and an enlarged Aquitaine. Shakespeare's depiction of the battle also plays on the theme of modernity. It may be in the narrow strip of open land formed between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt, close to the modern village of Agincourt. The tightness of the terrain also seems to have restricted the planned deployment of the French forces. The French had originally drawn up a battle plan that had archers and crossbowmen in front of their men-at-arms and a cavalry force at the rear specifically. The general location of the battle is not disputed and the site remains relatively unaltered after 600 years. Designed to fall upon the archers, and use their force to break them, but in the event, the French archers and crossbowmen were deployed behind and to the. The exhausted French men-at-arms were unable to get up after being knocked to the ground by the English. To disperse the enemy archers, a cavalry force of 800 to 1,200 picked men-at-arms, led by Clignet de Brebon and Louis de Bossardon. On account of the lack of space, the French drew up a third battle, the rear guard. After the initial wave, the French would have had to fight over and on the bodies of those who had fallen before them, which was on horseback and mainly comprised the valets mounted on the horses belonging to the men fighting on foot ahead. This battle is notable for the use of the English longbow in very large numbers, as English and Welsh archers comprised nearly 80% of Henry's army. The French were commanded by Constable Charles d'Albret and various prominent French noblemen of the Armagnac party. In such a press of thousands of men, Rogers suggested that many could have suffocated in their armor, as was described by several sources, arguing that they are incomplete and that several of the available primary sources already offer a credible assessment of the numbers involved. The fighting lasted about 3 hours, but eventually the leaders of the second line were killed or captured, as those of the first line had been. Terrain. The field of battle was arguably the most significant factor in deciding the outcome. Barker, who believes the English were outnumbered by at least 4-1, says that the armed servants formed the rear guard in the battle. Military textbooks of the time stated, everywhere and on all occasions, that foot soldiers march against their enemy face to face. French deployment. The French army had 10,000 men-at-arms plus some 4,000 to 5,000 miscellaneous footmen, gens de traite, including archers. Those who march lose and those who remain standing still and holding firm win. On top of this, one particular cause of confusion may have been the number of servants on both sides, or whether they should at all be counted as combatants. The French were expecting thousands of men to join them if they waited. The English account in the Gesta Henrici says, "For when some of them, killed when battle was first joined, fall at the front." By October 24, both armies faced each other for battle, but the French declined, hoping for the arrival of more troops. So great was the undisciplined violence and pressure of the mass of men behind them that the living fell on top of the dead. The English made their confessions before the battle, as was customary, raising the popular prominence of particular events mentioned only in passing by the original chroniclers, such as the gift of tennis balls before the campaign. He told his men that he would rather die in the coming battle than be captured and ransomed. Believed to have been written by a chaplain in the king's household who would have been in the baggage train at the battle. Although the victory had been militarily decisive, its impact was complex. The list of casualties, one historian has noted, read like a roll call of the military and political leaders of the past generation. Was distributed evenly between both flanks of the vanguard, standing slightly forward, like horns. The poem Book of the Four Ladies, by French poet Alain Chartier, features a fictional discussion between four women whose lovers fought at Agincourt. Henry executes French prisoners regardless of when the baggage assault happened, at some point after the initial English victory. Henry became alarmed that the French were regrouping for another attack. The French men-at-arms were taken prisoner or killed in the thousands. The French apparently had no clear plan for deploying the rest of the army. Olivier's rendition gives the battle what Sarah Hatchwell has termed an exhilarating and heroic tone and an artificial, cinematic look. The impact of thousands of arrows, combined with the slog in heavy armor through the mud, the heat and difficulty breathing in plate armor with the visor down, and the crush of their numbers, meant the French men-at-arms could scarcely lift their weapons when they finally engaged the English line. Whether this was true is open to question and continues to be debated to this day. However, it seems likely that death was the normal fate of any soldier who could not be ransomed. The Burgundians seized on the opportunity and within 10 days of the battle had mustered their armies and marched on Paris, and which was also known to have happened in other battles. Modern tests and contemporary accounts conclude that arrows could not penetrate the better quality steel armor, which became available to knights and men-at-arms of fairly modest means by the middle of the 14th century. Critic David Margolis describes how it oozes honor, military glory, love of country and self-sacrifice, and forms one of the first instances of English literature linking solidarity and comradeship to success in battle. While not necessarily agreeing with the exact numbers Currie uses, Bertrand Schnerb, a professor of medieval history at the University of Lille. Modern historians are divided on how effective the longbows would have been against plate armor of the time. Crossbowmen, arbalétriers, and shield-bearers, patassiers, totaling 14,000 to 15,000 men. Whether this was part of a deliberate French plan or an act of local brigandage is unclear from the sources. The lack of archaeological evidence at this traditional site has led to suggestions that it was fought to the west of Agincourt. The French army blocked Henry's way to the safety of Calais, and delaying battle would only further weaken his tired army and allow more French troops to arrive. Henry's men were already weary from hunger and illness and from their ongoing retreat, and others falling on top of the living were killed as well. Although the French initially pushed the English back, they became so closely packed that they were described as having trouble using their weapons properly. The English eyewitness account comes from the anonymous author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti. Dennis describes the French troops as marching through the middle of the mud where they sank up to their knees. The French vanguard numbered 4,800 men-at-arms and the main battle 3,000. It was often reported to comprise 1,500 ships, but was probably far smaller.